Deep in the inner sanctum of the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, carved into stone walls built during the Ptolemaic period around 225 BCE, there are images that should not exist. Not because the temple is mysterious, Dendera is one of the most studied sites in Egypt, but because what those carvings appear to show is an electric light bulb. The relief spans several panels, in each a large elongated object, bulbous at one end, narrowing toward a base that sits atop what unmistakably resembles a lotus flower, stands upright while human figures support it from below. Inside the object, a serpent extends its full length from end to end, its body arched, its form running through what appears to be a sealed glass envelope. A braided cord or cable-like structure connects the base to a separate rectangular object that some researchers have described as resembling an insulating support or socket. The scale of the object in relation to the human figures around it places it at roughly the size of a large vase, or depending on how you measure, a tall industrial lamp. Fringe researchers have compared these reliefs directly to Crookes tubes, the 19th century glass vacuum tubes that preceded the modern light bulb. The structural parallels are uncomfortable. The elongated glass enclosure, the internal filament analog, the insulated base. Some go further, pointing to the so-called Baghdad battery, a 2,000-year-old clay jar found in modern-day Iraq, containing copper cylinders and iron rods capable of generating a small electrical charge. The argument is simple. If the ancient Near East had primitive electrochemical cells and trade routes connected Baghdad to the Nile Valley, could the Egyptians have had some functional understanding of electrified light? Mainstream Egyptology says no, and not without evidence. The serpent in the carving is not a filament, it's a deity. The lotus is not a socket base. It's one of the most loaded symbols in all of Egyptian cosmology, representing creation and emergence from primordial water. The human figures are not technicians, they are priests performing a ritual act. This reading is consistent with dozens of similar symbolic configurations found across Ptolemaic temple walls, where lotus, serpent, and sky deities appear together in cosmological groupings. More critically, no conductive material, no wiring, no infrastructure of any kind has ever been found at Dendera or at any other Egyptian site. If these people were generating and distributing light, there is zero physical evidence of how. That should settle it, and for most researchers it does. But the shape is very specific. The serpent doesn't float in open space the way Egyptian deities usually do. It's contained, enclosed, positioned precisely within the silhouette of the outer form. Other lotus and serpent combinations in Egyptian art don't look like this. None of them produce the same visual dissonance. The mainstream explanation is entirely plausible. The carving just doesn't look like a religious symbol. It looks like something someone saw. The Temple of Seti I at Abydos is not a fringe archaeological site. It is one of the most sacred, most studied, most documented temples in Egypt. A structure built to honor 7 gods simultaneously, its walls covered in some of the finest painted reliefs ever produced in the ancient world. This is not a place where important details get overlooked. And yet on a ceiling beam in one of the temple's inner chambers, there is a cluster of hieroglyphs that has stopped people cold since photographs of it began circulating in the 1990s. Look at the image without any context. What you see is a helicopter, a clear fuselage, a rotor blade assembly above it, a tail section. Directly beside it, something that looks unmistakably like a submarine. Next to that, what appears to be a modern fixed-wing aircraft, and partially visible nearby, a shape that observers have compared to a battle tank. All of them within a few inches of each other, carved in stone, in a temple built over 3,000 years ago. The explanation offered by Egyptologists is well established and, once understood, is entirely convincing. Seti I built the temple and had his name and titles inscribed throughout. His son, Rameses II, later carved new inscriptions over some of his fathers, a standard practice in ancient Egypt. The plaster applied to smooth over the transition eventually cracked and fell away over centuries. What remained was 2 layers of partial text, overlapping imperfectly, creating composite shapes that neither inscription ever intended. The process is called a palimpsest. The helicopter is, in this reading, a printing error in stone. That's the science, it's solid. But the image went viral before the explanation reached most people who saw it. And some of the photographs that spread online had been digitally altered. Backgrounds removed, contrast increased, surrounding hieroglyphs cropped out. To sharpen the resemblance to modern vehicles and eliminate the contextual clutter that makes the palimpsest visible. So there are at least two layers of manipulation at work: the accidental one that created the image, and the deliberate one that spread it. Even knowing all of that, people still see the helicopter. The palimpsest doesn't unsee itself once you've read about it, which raises a question that isn't really about ancient Egypt at all. What does it mean when an accident in stone, a collision of two unrelated texts degraded by time, produces something that looks more like the future than either of the originals? No one has a satisfying answer to that. In 1952, archaeologists excavating inside the Temple of the Inscriptions at Palenque in southern Mexico broke through a sealed stone floor and descended a hidden staircase into a burial chamber that had not been opened in over 1,200 years. At the center of the room lay a massive limestone sarcophagus, its lid a single carved slab weighing roughly 5 tons. The figure depicted across its surface was Kinech Janab Pakal, king of Palenque for 68 years, one of the longest reigning rulers in all of Maya history. For 16 years, the carving was studied by scholars and understood within the conventions of Maya funerary art. Then, in 1968, Erich von Däniken published Chariots of the Gods, and everything changed. What von Däniken saw was not a king entering the afterlife. He saw a man seated and leaning forward at a control panel, both hands working what appeared to be mechanical instruments, feet pressed against what looked like pedals. Below the figure, fire and gases shot downward in a cone, the silhouette of rocket propulsion. A curved tube connected to the man's face, suggesting a breathing apparatus. Von Däniken placed the image directly alongside photographs of Project Mercury astronauts sealed inside their capsules. The body position, the enclosed cockpit, the exhaust plume at the base. The resemblance was close enough that it didn't require imagination to see it. It required imagination to unsee it. The image spread. It became one of the most reproduced artifacts in alternative history and remains so today. Maya scholars and epigraphers have gone through this carving element by element. Pakal is not piloting anything, and he is descending, falling into Xibalba, the Maya underworld, the realm of death that kings were understood to pass through before resurrection. The serpent rising behind him is the world tree, the cosmic axis linking underworld, earth, and sky, a motif appearing consistently across centuries of classic Maya art. The flames are not exhaust. They belong to a skeletal deity stationed at the underworld threshold. The tube near his face is not an oxygen line. A jade bead necklace was physically recovered from the tomb, right where it appears in the carving. Every component read through established Maya iconographic convention has a direct parallel in other documented works. That reading is not a defensive invention. It is rigorous and thoroughly supported. And yet both interpretations are drawn from the exact same image, the same carved stone, the same body, the same surrounding composition. One asks you to accept that a 7th century Maya king was buried beneath an elaborate scene of cosmological descent into death. The other asks you to believe he was buried beneath a depiction of spaceflight. Only one of those is genuinely difficult to account for. The desert of southern Peru is one of the driest places on Earth. Almost no rain, almost no wind. A climate so stable that lines scraped into the ground over 2,000 years ago look as though they were made last week. That stability is the only reason we know the Nazca lines exist at all. And it makes what's there even harder to explain. Stretching across more than 450 square kilometers of arid plateau, the lines were created by removing the reddish-brown surface layer of iron oxide pebbles to expose the pale yellow-gray ground beneath. A process so simple that modern researchers have replicated sections of it, using nothing but wooden stakes and rope. The technology required to make them was minimal, no mystery there. What's harder to account for is the scale. The largest figures approach 900 feet across. A single hummingbird, wings outstretched, stretches longer than the Eiffel Tower is tall. The condor, the spider, the monkey with its coiled tail, an orca gripping a knife in what appears to be a clenched appendage. These are not scrawls. They are precise, continuous, unbroken lines, forming images of enormous complexity. Images that can only be fully understood from the air. In 2024, a team from Yamagata University used artificial intelligence to identify 303 previously unknown geoglyphs scattered across the plateau. including a 72-foot killer whale brandishing a blade, its form matching ceremonial pottery imagery from the same cultural period. The sheer number of figures still being discovered after decades of study suggests the Nazca people spent centuries on this project. Mainstream archaeology has offered several frameworks. Ritual walkways meant to be walked rather than viewed. Astronomical alignments, some figures do correspond to solstice and equinox positions. Markers pointing toward underground water sources in a region where water was precious. These are serious proposals backed by serious researchers, and some of the evidence is genuinely persuasive. But none of them fully resolve the central problem. You do not need a 900-foot hummingbird to mark a water source. You do not need geometric perfection visible only at altitude to walk a ceremonial path. The scale and the precision exceed any practical function that has been credibly proposed. The most unsettling possibility isn't that the Nazca people had aircraft. There's no evidence of that. The unsettling possibility is simpler, that they were making something for an audience they believed existed above them. What is the purpose of an image designed only for a perspective its creators never had? That question has been sitting in the Peruvian desert for 2,000 years. No one has answered it. The Quimbaya people flourished in what is now Colombia between roughly 300 and 1550 CE. They were exceptional metalworkers. Their gold funerary objects are held today in museums in Bogota and Madrid, regarded as among the finest examples of pre-Columbian craftsmanship anywhere in the Americas. Roughly 120 small figurines survive from their culture, most of them zoomorphic. Fish, frogs, birds with rounded bodies and recognizable beaks, the kinds of stylized animal representations that appear across dozens of cultures from the same era. A handful look wrong. Not crude, not unfinished. Wrong in a very specific way. Their wings sweep back at the angle of a delta configuration. A vertical tail fin rises from the rear, not a horizontal one, a vertical one, a feature that appears on no animal alive or extinct. Horizontal stabilizers extend from either side of the tail assembly. The underside carries a flat structure that multiple engineers looking at photographs without prompting have independently described as resembling fixed landing gear. There are no feathers anywhere on these objects, no beak, no visible legs. In 1994, two German aerospace engineers named Peter Belting and Konrad Lubbers decided to test the obvious question. They built scaled-up versions of the most aerodynamically anomalous figurines and ran them through a wind tunnel. The models flew, not erratically and stably with the kind of consistent lift and directional control that engineers recognize as intentional design rather than coincidence. Mainstream archaeology's position is that these are stylized birds or insects, that the aerodynamic geometry is a byproduct of artistic convention rather than technical knowledge. That's a reasonable argument. The Quimbaya produced thousands of animal figures, and the overwhelming majority are clearly identifiable, recognizable species, familiar forms. Stylization does strange things to natural shapes. Wings get abstracted. Bodies become geometric. It's possible. But the other figures don't cause this problem. The fish look like fish. The frogs look like frogs. The birds with beaks and rounded bodies look like birds. These few don't look like any of that. And the vertical tail fin doesn't emerge from stylization. No bird has one. No artistic simplification of a real animal produces one. It is a structural feature with a specific aerodynamic function, present in these objects and nowhere else in nature. If you held one of these figurines without knowing anything about the Quimbaya, you would not call it a bird. You would guess it was built by someone who understood what it means for an object to move through air. The Jomon culture of prehistoric Japan lasted from approximately 14,000 BCE to 300 BCE. Nearly 14,000 years of continuous habitation, making it one of the longest-running cultural periods ever documented. They left behind pottery, tools, dwellings, and something else entirely. Small clay figurines, hundreds of them, called dog. And they are not like other ancient figurines. The most famous examples, particularly those from the late Jomon period, around 1000 BCE, have eyes that bulge outward in wide circular discs, ringed with segmented frames that sit on the face like goggles. The heads are rounded and helmet-like, the crowns sometimes marked with ridges or seams. The bodies are covered in what appear to be layered garments. ribbed sections running horizontally across the torso and limbs, surface textures that suggest thick material rather than skin. The joints at the shoulders and hips are pronounced and rounded in a way that looks less like human anatomy and more like articulated suit components. The hands are stubby, the feet flat and wide, like boots. Mainstream archaeology interprets the dog as ritual objects associated with fertility, healing, and shamanic practice. That reading is entirely plausible. Small human figurines serving spiritual functions appear across dozens of prehistoric cultures worldwide, and the Jomon had a rich ceremonial life supported by substantial archaeological evidence. But none of those other cultures produced something that looks like a pressure suit. The fertility idol comparison requires a significant leap. Fertility figures across cultures emphasize the human body: curves, anatomy, recognizable form. The dog obscure the body almost entirely beneath what appears to be a covering. Whatever is underneath, you cannot see it. There is also this. The dog were intentionally broken before burial. Arms snapped off, heads removed. The destruction was deliberate, part of the ritual. Which means very few complete examples survive, and the ones that do required extraordinary luck or care in their preservation. The fragmentation makes study harder. It also deepens the strangeness, because someone thought these objects were important enough to bury and dangerous or necessary enough to break first. What the Yeoman people were looking at when they shaped these figures, something real, something imagined, something encountered in a state of ritual-altered consciousness, has never been satisfactorily answered. The mainstream explanation covers the function. It doesn't cover the form. In 1898, a small wooden object was pulled from a tomb at Saqqara, Egypt. It was dated to around 200 BCE. Someone labeled it wooden bird model, added it to a collection at the Cairo Museum, and placed it in storage. It sat there for 71 years. In 1969, a doctor named Khalil Masiha was working through a tray of bird figures recovered from the same tomb. Votive offerings, ceremonial models, the kinds of carved animals that appear constantly in Egyptian funerary contexts. He picked up the Saqqara object and stopped. It had no feathers, no feet, no horizontal tail structure. What it had was a fuselage, a tapered body with a cross-section that Masiha recognized immediately from aviation, the same curved profile used in high-wing monoplane design to generate lift, and at the rear, rising vertically from the body, a single upright fin. No bird has a vertical tail fin, not one living species, not one extinct species identified in the fossil record. The vertical stabilizer is a human invention developed in the early 20th century to control yaw, the left-right rotation of an aircraft in flight. Its presence on the Saqqara object is not a stylistic choice that happens to resemble aviation technology. It is the thing that makes aviation possible. Messiha built a scaled replica from balsa wood. It glided cleanly across the room. Later aerodynamic tests on replicas of the original dimensions confirmed that the design generates lift at low flight speeds. The object behaves in testing conditions like a functional glider. Mainstream archaeology's response is measured and not unreasonable. Egypt had an extensive tradition of bird worship. Votive models of sacred birds, ibis, falcon, vulture, were placed in tombs as a matter of ritual routine. A carved wooden bird is not anomalous in that context. Stylized or abstract renderings of animals are common. The missing feet and feathers could reflect simplification rather than intention. But here is what that explanation cannot absorb. Thousands of bird figures survive from ancient Egypt. None of them have a vertical stabilizer, not one. The motif does not appear in Egyptian art on any bird, in any medium, across any period. This object has a feature that no bird possesses that serves a specific aerodynamic function and that appears nowhere else in the culture that produced it. How does a civilization arrive at a vertical stabilizer without already knowing what one does? The temple complex of Ta Prohm sits in Siem Reap, Cambodia, built by the Khmer Empire around 1186 CE. Most people know it as the Jungle Temple, the one where tree roots have grown through the stone walls over centuries, splitting archways and swallowing doorframes. It appears in photographs constantly. It has been studied exhaustively. Among its hundreds of carved panels depicting gods, serpents, deer, and monkeys, one small relief on a sandstone column has generated more debate than almost anything else at the site. The carving shows an animal. It has a short neck, a thick, rounded body, four sturdy legs, and a series of vertical plates running along its back in a regular pattern from shoulders to tail. Those plates don't curve. They don't taper into points like leaves. They rise vertically from the spine, each one roughly the same height, spaced evenly, exactly the arrangement of dorsal plates on a stegosaurus. Stegosaurus went extinct approximately 145 million years ago. The Khmer Empire existed in the 12th century CE. The gap between those two dates is not a rounding error. Creationists have used the carving as evidence that humans and dinosaurs coexisted, which would require dismantling essentially all of modern paleontology. Ancient astronaut theorists argue it reflects knowledge inherited from a far older civilization. Neither explanation has gained any serious academic traction. The mainstream position is that the animal is a stylized boar or possibly a chameleon, set against a background of decorative foliage, the vertical shapes being leaves rather than dorsal plates. Stare at the carving long enough and you can see both. The boar is there if you need it to be. So is the dinosaur. But the leaf explanation requires those particular shapes to behave very differently from every other leaf carved at Teprom. They don't curl, they don't branch, they don't taper to points. They protrude from the animal's spine in a rigid, evenly spaced vertical row, the exact configuration of a stegosaurus, not the decorative flora covering every other surface of the temple. No formal analysis has ever definitively identified what the carving depicts. No institution has published a conclusive answer. In an era of digital modeling, CT scanning, and remote archaeological analysis, that silence is harder to explain than the carving itself. The Ica stones are the only entry on this list where the hoax verdict is almost certainly correct. Near the town of Ica in southern Peru, beginning in the 1960s, thousands of engraved andesite stones began surfacing through local farmers and market traders. They passed eventually into the collection of a physician named Javier Cabrera Darquea, who became the stone's most passionate advocate and built an entire museum around them. By the time serious researchers began examining the collection, it numbered over 15,000 pieces. The images on them should not exist. Humans hunting Triceratops and Brachiosaurus. Figures performing what appear to be open-heart surgery and blood transfusions. The surgical patient's chest opened, the heart visible, attending figures holding instruments. Men consulting what looked like telescopes. Maps of the American continents carved into stone at a time when no one in Peru was supposed to know those continents had a shape. The debunking was thorough. A local farmer admitted under questioning that he had carved the stones himself, demonstrated the technique on a fresh stone, and produced the dental drill he used. More damaging still, the dinosaur depictions on the stones show lumbering animals dragging their tails along the ground. The posture assumed in mid-20th century reconstructions that paleontology has since abandoned entirely. No one who actually observed a living dinosaur would have carved them that way. Someone who grew up watching monster movies or flipping through illustrated science books from the 1950s might have. The stones are a modern fabrication. That conclusion is well supported. What no one has explained is why. 15,000 stones. Not a small side project. Not a few weeks of work to sell trinkets to tourists. A sustained effort spanning decades, depicting a coherent alternative version of human history with its own internal logic. Ancient surgery, coexisting species, advanced astronomical knowledge as maintained across an enormous body of objects with remarkable consistency. The commercial motive is weak. Individual carved stones sold for very little. The ideological motive is equally unclear. No religious movement, no political agenda, no obvious beneficiary ever emerged from the collection. Someone committed an enormous portion of their life to constructing a false history in stone. The hoax is real. The obsession behind it has never been explained. The Chenakasava Temple in Karnataka, India, was built around 1268 CE under the Hoysala Empire. If you have never seen a Hoysala temple, the exterior is difficult to describe without sounding like an exaggeration. Every surface is carved, floor to ceiling, band after band of figures. Deities, dancers, elephants, battle scenes, mythological creatures. arranged with such density and precision that individual sections have been studied as independent works of art for decades. The craftsmanship is extraordinary by any standard. Somewhere in those thousands of figures mounted on an elephant, a warrior holds a weapon. That weapon is the Vajra, the divine thunderbolt of the god Indra, one of the oldest and most consistently depicted objects in Hindu iconography. The Vajra appears across centuries of Indian religious art in various forms: a club, a scepter, a multi-pronged implement. Its presence at Chenakasava is not unusual. What is unusual is how this particular one was carved. The device in this relief consists of a central rod with pointed rectangular structures at both ends, not the rounded or bladed forms typical of Vajra depictions elsewhere. Between those end structures, layered forms suggest an internal architecture, concentric elements that engineers examining the carving have described as visually consistent with primary and secondary coil configurations, with a capacitor-like structure positioned between them. The overall geometry maps without significant distortion onto a Tesla coil. Ancient texts describing the Vajra are specific about its power: a weapon capable of releasing energy equivalent to a lightning strike, roughly 1 billion joules. The same order of magnitude as a Tesla coil operating at high voltage discharge. The mainstream reading is religious. The Vajra is symbolic. Its form follows iconographic tradition. A sculptor depicting a divine weapon carved it elaborately because that is what Hoysala sculptors did. Every object at this temple is rendered with extraordinary detail. That is almost certainly the correct explanation. But the structural specificity of this carving, the layered internal architecture, the symmetry of the end formations, these are unusual even within the Hoysala tradition. The question isn't whether an 800-year-old sculptor understood electromagnetic induction. The question is what he was looking at when he decided to carve it that way. Look at where these 10 things come from. Not from obscure ruins in uncharted territory, not from the margins of the archaeological record. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera is one of the most thoroughly documented religious sites in Egypt. The Temple of Seti I at Abydos has been studied continuously since the 19th century. Palenque is one of the most excavated Maya sites in existence. Taprom has been photographed by millions of tourists. The Chenakasava Temple is a UNESCO-recognized architectural monument. The Cairo Museum has held the Saqqara object since 1898. These artifacts are not hidden. They are in display cases. They sit in cataloged collections under proper lighting, surrounded by scholarly literature. The mystery isn't buried in some undiscovered jungle. It's in the museums. It always has been. The mainstream explanations for each of these are not wrong. That needs to be said plainly. Pareidolia is a real cognitive phenomenon, and the human brain is pattern-seeking by design, and it will find faces in clouds and helicopters in eroded stone. Palimpsests are real. Religious symbolism is real and rich and complex and capable of producing forms that resemble other things. Hoaxes are real, and the Ica stones are almost certainly one. These explanations exist for good reasons, and serious researchers have applied them seriously. But something shifts when you step back from each individual case and look at all 10 together. They span 14,000 years in every inhabited continent. They emerge from cultures with no contact with each other: prehistoric Japan, Ptolemaic Egypt, pre-Columbian Colombia, medieval Cambodia, Jomon-era island settlements. The gap between them, geographically and chronologically, should make any shared pattern statistically improbable. And yet the pattern keeps appearing. An artifact that contains a structural feature, an aerodynamic principle, an electrical configuration, a biological form that its makers should not have had access to. Not once, not twice. 10 times, drawn from the most studied archaeological record humanity has produced. Coincidence explains 1 or 2. A pattern of 10 requires a different kind of accounting. The debate around these carvings has been collapsed over decades of books and television and online argument into 2 positions. Either ancient people had no sophisticated knowledge and every anomalous artifact is a misreading, or extraterrestrial visitors built everything and human beings were passive observers of their own history. Both of those positions are conversation enders. Both require you to stop asking questions. The third possibility gets crowded out, that human beings across thousands of years of isolated and continuous experimentation may have arrived at insights, aerodynamic, electromagnetic, astronomical, that we subsequently lost, buried, or failed to recognize when we found them again. That ingenuity is not a modern invention. That the distance between ancient and advanced is smaller than the standard account of history prefers. These carvings are still here, sitting in museums and temples and desert plateaus, exactly where they were left. The people who made them are not. And we are still, after all this time, arguing about what they were trying to show us.